You turn 19, you're accepted into a good university, your career is finally starting to take shape, and then you pause everything for roughly a year and a half to put on a uniform. Not because you chose a military career. Not because there's a war happening right now. Simply because you're a South Korean man, and the law says you have to. Almost every able-bodied man in South Korea is legally required to serve in the military, typically between 18 and 20 months, depending on the branch. This isn't a small volunteer program. It touches nearly the entire male population of an otherwise fully modern, developed, technologically advanced democracy. So why does a country this wealthy, this stable, still require this from its own citizens? But almost every is an important distinction. Not every Korean man serves in the same way, and some are exempt or assigned alternative forms of service depending on their health, disability, or individual circumstances. Certain elite athletes have also received special treatment under Korea's system, allowing them to fulfill their national duty through alternative service rather than standard active duty enlistment. These exceptions have occasionally sparked controversy, especially when celebrities or high-profile figures are perceived as receiving privileges unavailable to ordinary young men. The answer starts with a fact that surprises a lot of people who only know Korea through its pop culture and technology exports. The Korean War never actually ended. What stopped the fighting in 1953 was an armistice, a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. Legally and militarily, North and South Korea remain in a state of suspended war to this day, separated by one of the most heavily fortified borders on the planet. Political scientist Victor Cha, who has written extensively on Korean security policy, has described the peninsula as existing in a kind of permanent, low-grade state of military readiness that most other developed democracies simply don't have to maintain. Picture what that actually means in practical terms, not just as an abstract legal fact. North Korea maintains one of the largest standing armies in the world, positioned along a border that sits within artillery range of Seoul, a city holding roughly half the country's entire population and a significant share of its economic output. This isn't a distant, theoretical threat sitting somewhere over a horizon. It's a few dozen kilometers away from the country's economic and political center, close enough that any serious escalation would put an enormous portion of South Korea's population and economy in immediate danger. Here's where conscription enters the picture as a practical response rather than an abstract tradition. Maintaining a large enough standing military to credibly deter that threat, entirely through professional volunteer soldiers, would be extraordinarily expensive for a country South Korea's size. Defense economist Kim Jin-moo has pointed out that conscription allows South Korea to maintain a force of several 100,000 active troops, backed by millions more in reserves, at a fraction of what an all-volunteer force of the same scale would cost. It's less a cultural preference for military service and more a direct cost calculation about how a mid-sized country sustains a credible deterrent against a much larger, unpredictable neighbor. Picture what the actual experience looks like for the young men living through it. You're pulled out of university, out of an early career, out of dating and normal social life for close to 2 years, during which you're paid a fraction of a civilian wage, subject to strict hierarchy and discipline, and often stationed somewhere far from home. Sociologist Sung-Suk Moon has documented how this experience has become deeply woven into Korean masculinity itself, treated less as an interruption to be endured and more as a defining, almost universal rite of passage that shapes how Korean men relate to each other for the rest of their lives, since virtually every man they know has been through some version of the same experience. Now here's the counterintuitive twist that complicates the simple story of shared national sacrifice. This system creates real, documented social friction, particularly around gender. Because women are not required to serve, Some young Korean men have voiced frustration that 2 years of their most competitive career building and dating years get taken from them while women their age don't face the same setback. A grievance that has become entangled with broader, often contentious gender debates in Korean online culture and politics. Political scientist Jun Lee has noted that this resentment, whatever one thinks of its fairness, has become a genuine and measurable factor in Korean electoral politics, with several recent elections seeing candidates explicitly courting young male voters partly around this exact grievance. There's also a documented cost on the other side of the ledger, one less discussed in casual conversation about the system. Suicide and mental health concerns within the military have been the subject of ongoing government scrutiny and reform efforts, precisely because conscription pulls in young men regardless of their individual psychological readiness for the intensity of military hierarchy and isolation. The Ministry of National Defense has introduced expanded mental health screening and support programs in recent years, responding directly to documented concerns raised by soldiers, families, and outside researchers about the human cost embedded in a system built primarily around strategic necessity rather than individual circumstance. Picture the fuller arc, side by side. A 19-year-old leaving his first semester of college to report for basic training, uncertain what the next 2 years will actually feel like. A defense economist calculating exactly how many active duty troops a mid-sized economy can sustain against a much larger neighbor without conscription. A young man returning to civilian life 2 years later, treated by peers and employers alike as having completed an unspoken, universally understood rite of passage that shapes how the rest of his adult life gets read by everyone around him. Each piece connects back to the same unresolved fact sitting quietly underneath all of it. A war that technically never ended. It's worth noting South Korea isn't entirely alone in maintaining conscription, but the comparison is instructive. Countries like Israel face a comparably persistent security threat and also conscript, though notably Israel conscripts women as well, a policy difference frequently cited in Korean debates about fairness. Most other wealthy democracies, meanwhile, phased out conscription decades ago precisely because they no longer faced an active, unresolved territorial standoff serious enough to justify the economic and social cost. South Korea's continued reliance on the system isn't really a matter of falling behind global norms. It's a direct reflection of being one of the few developed democracies that still shares a live, heavily armed border with a technically unresolved war on the other side of it. Here's what this reflects back onto you. It's tempting to look at mandatory conscription and assume it simply reflects a militaristic culture, something unusually harsh compared to how other modern democracies operate. The more honest picture is that South Korea is one of the only fully developed, prosperous democracies still living, day to day, inside the unresolved legal aftermath of a war most of the world stopped thinking about 70 years ago. Conscription isn't really a cultural choice. It's what a country does when peace, on paper, was never actually declared. You started this picturing a 19-year-old pausing his entire life to put on a uniform he didn't choose. Now you know that pause isn't really about tradition or a militaristic mindset. It's the ongoing, unresolved cost of a ceasefire that was only ever meant to be temporary, quietly extending itself one mandatory service term at a time, into the lives of an entire generation who happened to be born on the wrong side of a war that, on paper, is still technically happening.